Good morning, everyone. I'm Kim Roos, and I am the CEO of the Calgary Women's Mercy Shelter and the co-chair of the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective. Each year, the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective recognizes Family Violence Prevention Month in November, along with other communities across our province. The Provincial Awareness Month intends to shed light on this complex issue, open difficult conversations, and encourage individuals in our community to learn more about ways that they can help. As the world continues to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic and its far-reaching impacts, now more than ever, we need to bring awareness to the signs of family violence and abuse and learn more about the numerous organizations available in our community to help. During the first several months of the pandemic, we saw a decline in the number of calls to police, helplines, and service providers for support. This is a scary statistic, however, because we know that family violence actually didn't stop. Rather, the lockdown made it more challenging for people to leave abusive situations or access vital supports. As the summer began and things started to open up in our city, we slowly started to see the number of calls for support increase. We want to continue to remind people that all our services are operating and we are available for support during this time. Agencies have pivoted and made it possible to access support safely. The Family Violence Information Line received a 23% increase in calls from April to August in comparison to the same months last year. The chat service experienced an 83% increase in use this year over the same period in 2019. In the first 3 quarters of 2020, so January to September, the Calgary Police Service responded to about 9% more domestic incidents than above average. However, 80% of these calls are verbal altercations that escalated to the point that police were called, or situations where one party asked police to be present during an interaction with an intimate partner or family member. Reports of actual or threatened violence during the same period are around 10% lower than average. Many things could be contributing to this decrease, including decreased opportunity to report as people are at home with their partners more because of COVID-19. We want to encourage all Calgarians to take a moment this month to learn about family violence in our community and what you can do to help by visiting our website at cdvc.ca. I'll now open it for questions.
Can I just ask, so what are you hearing from people as far as the impact of COVID on their situations?
We're hearing that the complexity of violence is increasing, and so I think that different family circumstances, different stressors that are happening with people dealing with economic impact, it is creating more tension in families. It's creating situations where you no longer have those usual escapes, and so it's more difficult to reach out for help, and the tensions are higher, which leading to situations that may not have occurred without a pandemic in place.
And as far as the drop in violence, you would think that's a good thing, but you're concerned that maybe that's not.
Yeah, it's because we're concerned because it's almost like a shadow pandemic, and so the calls out are maybe decreasing, but the number, the complexity of the danger that people are seeing is increased. And so, for example, in this period of time, so there's a danger assessment score that shelters use to rate the lethality that women are facing. In the first 6 months of this year, the extreme category is up 47% compared to last year. And so we're seeing more weapons, we're seeing more diversity and complexity in the violence. Maybe the total numbers are maybe down. It's also difficult for people to get out and report. Like when you're in the same home as someone that's being violent and abusive, how do you get out to make that call? Yeah, sure. Yes, I'll let
Can I
Andrew
just talk about the informal supports piece? So although we saw a drop in the number of calls, we saw a massive increase in informal support, so friends and family members of those who are experiencing violence go way, way, way up. So one of the things that we know from Stats Can, from their general social survey, is that most victims of domestic violence actually never access a service. They don't access police, not groups, not shelter. That would be about 65% of victims. And those 65% of victims of domestic violence prior to COVID were accessing informal supports in order to deal with the violence. But because of COVID and all of the social isolation that happened and the distance from our regular supports, actually those are the people that became the most vulnerable during this time. And so we saw in our informal supports program, so that would be the program where we support those that are confidants and friends and family, the rates of accessing in that program went up 200%. And so I think we need to understand that there, as Kim said, it's a shadow pandemic where it shows us, first of all, the role of informal supporters, how much we are a caring community as a society, how much every Albertan does have a role in ending violence, and how we have to learn new ways of doing that during this time of the pandemic.
Can you just explain, because I missed it, like what do you mean by shadow pandemic?
So one of the things that we know and we've seen in other jurisdictions is as the pandemic, we've seen these charts, right, of the pandemic going up and down and flattening, and whatever's happening in terms of the pandemic, we're seeing almost exactly the same effects in terms of domestic violence. So when the pandemic started and we were all on lockdown, we didn't see very many calls. But as soon as lockdown ended and we saw also a spike in the rates of the pandemic, we also saw a spike in the rates of domestic violence calls. And that's been seen across all jurisdictions. So Europe has done more studies because they're a little farther ahead than we are, and they've very much witnessed it as a shadow pandemic, and we're also seeing the same thing in Calgary.
But what you're saying there is that during the down, like during the lockdown, is that it might have actually been really high, though, just not reported.
Right. Actually, not only would it have been really high, we know it was really high because of informal supporters reaching out to learn how to support. Just what was happening was that people weren't accessing the normal ways that you perceive that victims would access support through police, shelters, regular social service agencies.
So what's your message, I guess, to the informants or even to the women or men out there?
I think for me, the message to informal supporters are you are still super important in the lives of the people that you're supporting, and that there are ways to provide support that don't necessarily mean having someone over for a cup of tea or offering them a bed in your home overnight. And the way that you can learn what those methods are is by going to our website, realtalk.sages.realtalk.com. Is it .com? Let's just Google Real Talk and you'll find it, as well as being able to call the crisis line, because the crisis line, which is 234-7233, will also be able to help informal supporters as well navigate the people that they're helping into supports. Every Albertan has a role in addressing domestic violence, and we're really good at it when we know how to do it.
Can you talk just a little bit more about like riding that line between being safe and smart about how you react to this pandemic and to being a good ally and supporter to somebody who may be facing a difficult situation at home?
Like, we know all the things that Dr. Dina Henshaw has talked about, right? You can be in someone's presence while wearing a mask. And so it doesn't mean that you can't get together and connect with someone as long as you're taking appropriate precautions to make sure that you're not spreading the virus. We also know that most of us have phones, most of us can text, most of us can chat, all of those sort of things. And so it might be having an alternate type of conversation with someone because it's not safe for them to sit on the phone with you or sit on Zoom with you while their abusive partner is in the background, but they could definitely, go to a private room and text without necessarily that happening. But I would also say that don't ever estimate the value of even just sitting with someone while you're both wearing masks and still social distancing, because then that person knows that you're there for them.
Yeah, and so just one more thing on that sort of note. I feel like sometimes the message gets put like, okay, if you're a victim of this, you need to speak up, speak out. But I think there's an alternate message that's sort of starting to come where it's like, okay, you got to check in with people. Like it's on your personal responsibility to say, hey, I noticed you're seeming a little bit down. Like, what's going on? Is that?
That is exactly it. And that is what Real Talk is that we all the time with our friends and family are checking in with them all about COVID and all of the other stuff. Are you doing okay? How are you managing through this? It's just one more thing to say you don't seem to be yourself or something seems to be going on. Is everything okay? And we shouldn't be afraid of naming the behaviors that we see. It seems like your partner is controlling you and you're not able to be on the phone with me anymore. What's going on? Are you okay? It might just be I'm feeling really down about COVID and the pandemic and I don't want to ever leave my house, but it could also be I'm afraid.
The one thing that you may have said and I may have missed is you said there was an increase in complexity of the cases. Has there been an increase in calls sort of for actual people dying, like that sort of thing?
That is much more a Kim question. I'll let her.
The other end
Yeah,
of
the complexity question is a Kim question.
Actually, Andrew, just identify yourself before you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
My name is Andrea Silverstone. I'm the executive director of SAGES, and I am the co-chair of the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective.
Andrew, can you spell that for us?
Sure. Andrea, last name Silverstone, and SAGES is SAGESSE.
Okay. And Kim, can you do the same just before you answer?
So I'm Kim Roos, and that's KIM, RUS as in Sam E, and I'm the CEO of the Calgary Women's and Mercy Shelter and the co-chair of the Calgary Domestic Violence Collective. In terms of the complexity, I can't speak to more deaths necessarily, but I can speak to what we're seeing in the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter anyway, is that when clients are accessing our services compared to this time last year, they are dealing with more, an increased severity of potential violence. And so more threats, more weapons available. And so what happens is when anyone accesses our services, we do an assessment using a danger assessment tool that rates their level or their risk of lethality, which is the risk of death. And so there are several categories, with the top category being extreme. And so now we're seeing that has jumped 47%. So 47% more women are coming in with that rating. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the overall numbers might be down or similar, but I'm concerned about the level of danger that our clients are now facing.
Any other questions? We do also have Staff Sergeant Paul Wasney from our domestic conflict unit here at CDVC. Interested?
So yeah, my name's Paul Wasney, and it's Wozney, and I'm the Staff Sergeant in charge of the Domestic Conflict Unit for the Calgary Police Service. And I'm actually just want to echo the comments from both Andrea and Kim, speaking around domestic violence and that shadow pandemic that we've seen in Calgary with regards to that. Our numbers initially with the Calgary Police Service, and when I say that, I mean our first responders, our patrol officers. We saw our numbers initially when the pandemic hit, they dropped about 12%. And really what we attribute that to is the inability to report, is victims are living with their abusers, and they're not in any sort of a position to address that reporting piece. It wasn't until after we finally got out of it, we figured out what, from a community perspective, we figured out what COVID was all about. We figured out what that it's certainly a respiratory ailment, and that we are able to get a little bit more freedom in our lives. But I think more importantly, and I've been in the 3 years that I've been in this role, what I've seen is that this community continues to have what I describe as an epidemic of domestic violence. We continue to have issues around economy, around job loss. Households continue to have financial difficulties, and we've been able to really chart and diagnose that many of the issues around domestic violence have a financial component to it, and just as the city of Calgary, which is a beautiful city, and has amenities here and there, we do have an issue with our economy not being consistent, and we really do see that as the economy changes, and there's that ebb and flow to the economy. There's also that is also reflected in the domestic violence in Calgary, and that's of course a significant concern for us. I just want to also echo what these ladies were saying. If you have issues with domestic violence in your home, call us. We will come. We will never not come to your home. If you have friends or family that continue to be involved with domestic violence, call us. We will go to that home. We will go and check on those people in that home, and we'll ensure that we are not only checking on that home from a policing perspective, but we're also providing the appropriate resources in the community. And when I say that, whether it's shelter, counseling, access to any of those sort of resources, we can provide that as well. So again, I just want to be clear that we are never too busy to come to these calls, and we will come anytime we are called. Is there any questions?
I think maybe there's one. Just in terms of the little knowledge I have about domestic relationships, it seems sometimes that maybe a victim would be afraid to call the police for fear that their partner, whatever, is going to be charged, or something drastic is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Just because police show up, does that mean that a charge is going to be laid? Like, can you just talk about that?
Well, if we do show up and we can corroborate that an offense has occurred, that there's evidence that an offense occurred, and let's also talk about the different kinds of domestic violence. There's like a financial part to domestic violence. There's a coercive control piece to domestic violence, a sexual component, certainly physical force and threats. So there's different things that make up domestic violence. But if you're talking about the physical part of domestic violence, you see somebody with a black eye, or you see some sort of marks on their throat, if we can corroborate that, then we are going to lay charges in that instance. And what that really does is it does a couple things. Is it holds that offender accountable, The second thing is it gives a reprieve for that victim so that they can make some decisions. Do they want to stay in their relationship? Can they go out and seek help otherwise within the community or their families? The other part too is it allows us to get some counseling for that offender. It allows that offender to be brought before the courts to answer to their behavior. So there's a lot of different things that happen with that. I understand the fear that goes with that, but this is the Calgary Police Services and the greater community's response to domestic violence has changed 180 degrees in the last 10, 20, 30 years. We have the supports in place, we have the funding in place to help these people, and we want to help these people. We just don't know what's going on in every home, certainly in Calgary, and we need to be invited into those homes, if you will, through a phone call, through a complaint.
Could you talk about the equally safe women?
The what, sorry?
Equally safe, CRT?
Yeah, so an example of that is we work, so we have, I have 8 constables that work in 8 different policing districts in Calgary. Each one of those constables are paired with a social worker from within the community that are assigned to them full time. And what they're able to do is they're able to certainly look at the police officers look at the situation through the lens of policing and through the lens of the criminal code, and the community partners, the social workers, are looking at it through a social lens. They're looking at it where they need assistance, where they need help. One of the partners is the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association. So if we have communities that have perhaps there's a community, say there's a victim comes forward and that person has certain cultural issues, or there's translation issues, or there's those traditional home values that maybe they brought over here from overseas. We can address that. We have the resources and the knowledge in place to address that, and that's just one quick example of how we're trying to really work and bridge that gap with the community. Because I don't want the police, and I don't want us to be on an island. I want us to make sure that we're working with our community partners so that we can address the community concerns. And in this,
Sorry, saying the name of that program?
it's called Equally Safe. Yeah. And I'm sorry, that's my phone beeping right now, and I apologize. It's the black one. So, any other questions? Great, thank you very much for coming. And if you do have any requests for stats, for any of your supports, any of your stories that are domestic related, you can certainly fire your request to Corwin, and they'll come to me, and we can provide that information for you as well. So, great, thank you.